Okay, greetings and thanks for joining us. My name is Dr. Barry Boden. I'm an orthopedic surgeon at the Orthopedic Center, a division of CAO, and I'm joined by Scott Anderson, College Athletic Trainers Society past president, former head trainer at Oklahoma University for the football team, and a national leader in heat illness prevention. And we're going to be discussing exertional heat stroke, EHS, in football today. So what is exertional heat stroke? It occurs when the body is unable to cope with a heat load from exertion. In other words, there's excessive heat in the body that cannot be dissipated. And an athlete will develop an increased core body temperature. If that temperature goes above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, it's considered heat stroke, which is a very dangerous medical condition. So, Scott, can you review what are the warning signs and how do you recognize an athlete that may be entering heat illness?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Boden. Yeah, the key thing absolutely is early recognition, and then that can lead an opportunity for a removal and assessment and management as warranted. Education becomes a key piece. It's important to educate our players and educate our because some of the changes can be really subtle. And so, for instance, for an athletic trainer on a football, you could have 50 players there, and as an athletic trainer, watch and know every situation, but the coaches are watching and the teammates are watching and they're understanding, and so we want to give them some things to look for, and so a couple of along with the elevated core temperature that Dr. Boden mentioned of 105 degrees or higher, there's some mental status changes that appear as well. And we can think of these as fuzzy thinking and bizarre behavior, or some behavior that's unusual for that individual. And so fuzzy thinking, they're confused. They're not necessarily following directions. They're forgetful. And those aren't normal for that individual. And so again, coaches and teammates are going to see those early and pick up on those. And so we want them to be aware and notice and refer the player to an athletic trainer or remove them and seek some care and assistance. Their behavior may be unusual. They may be often angry and raging and combative for no reason whatsoever. They can have just a blank stare, just kind of be talking some nonsense. So looking for mental status changes, fuzzy thinking, bizarre behavior, those are things that could be picked up on the field. Certainly, we're not going to be able to look at somebody and tell their core temperature, for instance. And then we want to deal with those before we get to some points of physical collapse.
Right. So mental status changes, of course, are key there. And thanks for that information. And what about these other physical signs?
Yeah, we absolutely want to see those behavioral changes before we see the physical changes, because the physical changes can indicate that maybe we're a little bit further into it, and already a little bit more severe effect and more problematic to manage. But loss of coordination, if an individual's stumbling, staggering, at that point in time, it's certainly not benefiting them from a performance standpoint. They need to be drawn. They may be fatigued, and again, they're fatiguing earlier than one would think they should be. A little bit unusual to the fatigue, and so instead of exacerbating the problem, making it worse, pull them out. And so again, other things like nausea and vomiting. Ironically, they might have some chills and some goosebumps. They're just trying to cool itself, and that should be overbreathing, not overheating. So, but some hyperventilation, kind of, breathing heavily, and then obviously staggering, collapse, and into a seizure and coma. We absolutely, obviously, want to avoid this stage because, again, it's evidence of heat stroke and some dangerous effect going on to the body.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And so treatment for exertional heat stroke, well, first and foremost is to have an emergency action plan. And this should be available before the season starts. This should be prepared, it should be rehearsed. You need to be ready for one of these episodes if it were to happen. And you have to initiate treatment by moving the athlete to a cool location and initiating rapid cooling. And this can occur with ice packs in the armpit and groin, but really the gold standard for treatment is to measure the core body temperature and place the athlete in an ice bath, and then call 911. Do you have anything else to add on that, Scott?
Sorry.
Okay, great. So let's now focus on football and exertional heat stroke fatalities. We performed a study several years ago and found that football has the highest number of heat stroke fatalities for all sports, and it's the third most common cause of fatalities after cardiac and brain in football. And this is a picture from Sports Illustrated of Corey Stringer, who is suffering from heat stroke while his teammates and coaches and trainers just continue the practice. So, Scott, can you review some of the data on heat stroke over the last 40, 50 years and the trends that have occurred?
Sure. The first exertional heat stroke death recorded is 1955. It was a high school football player, and we can track since then. And between high school and collegiate football, there have been on average 2 deaths a year. And if we do a trend line through the graph, we see that that's been pretty steady. In the average decade, there's been 20. In the average year, there's been 2. If we take all those years and divide them out, we come out to about 2 a year. So it's been a very consistent 2 per year. Some years there are none. Some years there are more. They've had as many as 9 in a given year. So it does vary from year to year. But again, it's been very consistent. And so from decade to decade, in spite of the efforts that we have done to prevent these events from occurring, treatment protocols that we put into place consistently, it's been a predictable rate, and even today, it's been a predictable rate. In fact, in about the last 20 years, there's even been an uptick from 2 per year to closer to 3 football exertional heat stroke deaths per year. And that doesn't even include the numerous non-fatal exertional heat stroke cases that occurred.
Thank you. So in response to all of these heat fatalities, the NCAA developed the 2003 acclimatization bylaw. And can you review that bylaw for us, please, Scott?
Yes, it was put into effect in August of 2003, and it came in response to deaths that were occurring in off-season workouts. Not just preseason football, but throughout the off-season from January through September. And so a hallmark of that was a preseason acclimatization bylaw. It was a 5-day period of time, and it focused on uniform and a number of practices and duration of practices. And so it eliminated the 2-a-days. In those first 5 days. You could only have 1 practice, not 2. You progress from day 1 and day 2 were shorts only, no pads other than helmet. 3 and 4 allowed for shoulder pads with the helmet, and then day 5 was the first day of full pads. And so Again, the focus was on number of practice, duration of practice, and uniform. It didn't address factors such as intensity of exertion, the types of activities that could go on in that day or that given period of time, nor the individuals that are at risk.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. So in order to determine if the 2003 bylaw was effective, Scott and I decided to undertake a project where we looked at 43 heat fatalities in football over a 20-year span from 1998 to 2018. And what we found was that there was no substantial decline at the college or the high school level in heat fatalities despite implementation of this rule. What we did find was that the at-risk athlete was the lineman. 97% of the athletes in this study that died were linemen, and the average BMI of these athletes was 36.4. And we all know that obesity is a BMI over 30. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and as we look at that, and obesity has a connotation to it, and not necessarily a particularly healthy connotation. But one thing to keep in mind is this is reflective of the size of linemen. Linemen are big individuals. They're self-selected for that. It helps make them successful. And so, again, size is a factor. It's a factor because the bigger individuals respond to exercise differently. They tend to heat up faster. They cool down slower. They have a diminished ability to shed that internal heat that the Dr. Boden talked about early in terms of definition and what exertional heat stroke is. So they heat up fast. They don't shed heat very well. They tend to store it, because of higher fat content. And so, again, these individuals are typically healthy and motivated individuals. Again, it's virtually all linemen.
Important points. Thank you. We also found in the study that the primary cause of these heat fatalities was overexertion. 100% of the fatalities occurred during conditioning sessions. There were no fatalities during a game situation. And all the athletes were performing high-intensity aerobic training, such as serial sprints and time trials. And in at least 16 of the cases, they were performing punishment drills. The teams were often exercising as a unit, meaning that the linemen were expected to run with the wide receivers or the other skill players and just assume that they have the same aerobic fitness. And most of these fatalities also occurred during the preseason or the off-season. So this is a typical punishment scenario. A coach is angry at the player for perceived lack of effort. The coach decides to run punishment drills. We're going to do 36 sprints, sideline to sideline. The coach is screaming, we're going to run until somebody quits or drops. An athlete starts to struggle or collapses, and the coach starts screaming at the player and cursing at the player and forces his teammates to help the player up to continue. You got to finish the drill. We have to finish the drill. So this is a common scenario that unfortunately happens too often and seems to be part of the football culture. And have you seen this often, Scott?
Yeah, as you mentioned, 16 of the deaths that were identified were punishment related, and so we're a key take-home point, for this presentation is that these deaths are preventable, 100% preventable. Death shouldn't occur and heat stroke shouldn't occur. And that seems like a bold statement to make. But again, when you think that, greater than a third of these identified cases were punishment, we can easily say, well, we can prevent X number by eliminating using exertion as punishment. And so again, it's a part of the culture, but it's a part of the culture that needs to be reviewed and changed.
Absolutely. And so we really need to change the football culture. Roger Bannister, who was the first athlete to run a sub 4-minute mile, once said, "The notion that courage can somehow defeat the principles of physiology is not only wrong, but dangerously wrong. Remember, toughness cannot overcome physiology. The body can only adapt to training and conditioning at a very slow rate. We can't whip these athletes into shape in 2 days." So how about secondary risk factors? Well, when we looked at these fatalities, we found that the average temperature was in the 80s. So it was hot, but it wasn't super hot. 70% of the athletes were not wearing pads. So you don't necessarily have to be wearing the equipment pads. Maybe that's not as critical as we once thought. Many of the athletes were hydrated. So maybe dehydration is not as important as was once thought. How about the number and duration of practices? Well, most of these athletes died secondary to a 20 to 30-minute high intensity workout. Again, often performing repetitive sprints. So it probably doesn't take 2 practices and 5 hours of practice. So I'm not saying that these things aren't important. They are, but maybe we need to start thinking about other factors here and not just the heat and not just the equipment and the duration of the practice. Scott, would you concur? Have any other comments?
Absolutely, and again, we can go back decades, and as early as the '60s, there was an emphasis on reducing the uniform and practicing in the cool of the day, and an emphasis on hydration, and again, like Dr. Boden said, all of these are very important things to do, but the thing is that we have practiced those things, but consistently we're having the deaths are occurring anyway, and so there's something that we're missing, something we need to be paying attention to, something that we need to be adding to our precaution regimen, and in order to be able to reverse this occurrence.
So maybe it's time to change the paradigm to focusing only on heat and also start focusing on exertion, which appears to be a critical factor. And we did a study a couple years ago where we looked at the VO2 max of football athletes. And VO2 max is a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness or aerobic fitness. And what we found was that 88% of football players with a BMI greater than 30 had a VO2 max less than 40. Well, any VO2 max less than 40 is an indication of poor fitness. So why are we training these football linemen with skill players who likely have VO2 maxes in the 50s and 60s? So let's start talking about effective prevention strategies. Well, number one is that conditioning sessions should match game demand. We should never have punishment drills. We should be avoiding running the linemen with the skill players, and we should be avoiding serial sprints and avoiding time trials. And position-specific training, we need to start thinking more about this. How often do linemen run 10 repetitive 100-yard sprints during a game? They don't. They mostly run a maximum of 5 to 30 yards. The average play typically lasts 5 seconds. And there's usually an average of 35-second break between plays. So you're talking about an average work to rest ratio of 1 to 7. So we need to start training for the requirements of the game. Any comments, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. Position specific becomes very, very key in this. Again, especially for linemen. They have specific tasks different than a skill player does, a receiver or a defensive back or running back.
So let's talk about some proper training techniques. And the key here is to start low and build slow. And so one of the programs that's been effective is the 50, 30, 20, 10 rule for conditioning. And it takes 5 weeks to progress to full conditioning. So starting with week 1, you want to reduce your exercise conditioning by 50% compared to your prior year maximum level. You want to reduce it by 30% the second week, 20% the third week, and 10% the fourth week. So you're gradually building up, starting at 50% of your maximum. And it takes 5 weeks to progress to full. We have to gradually adjust to both the environment and the exercise intensity and the volume. So the key here is that we don't want to allow for high intensity, large volume workouts, such as a time mile or sustained sprints for distance conditioning tests in the first few weeks. We want to start at a very low level and build slowly. Scott, can you give us any more information on the 50, 30, 20, 10 rule?
Yeah, this was actually put forward by the strength coaches, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association, and it's a great way, I think, to start low and build slow. It's about a 5-week progression. You reduce the load by 50% the first week, to 30 the second week, then 20. And then 10. And so it's 5 weeks before you're full. And so you're not starting out with a large volume and intensity of work on individuals that are not acclimatized to the environment or acclimated to the workload that you're putting through. And so, again, it's a progression. You don't allow for the high intensity, large volume workouts, the time mild runs, sprinting and distance, particularly those things that we know create risk, and especially for the linemen. And so again, you give the individual some time to adapt to environment, time to adapt to the workload, and have a good exercise science-based approach, and an adherence to some sound exercise physiology in your training for your players. And this, along with what Dr. Boden mentioned before in terms of being very position specific, the position specificity, targets the intensity and the volume and those types of things as well.
I agree. I think this is just a great, easy tool to use. One of the issues with the 50, 30, 20, 10 program is that you may not know what an athlete's previous year maximum was, if they're a freshman or if they're a transfer. So we developed, and again, this is a busy slide, but we developed a program based on an athlete's BMI, and we came up with safe initial starting speeds for every BMI. And so let's go through a couple of scenarios here. So let's talk about Jordan McNair. Jordan was 6'4", 290 pounds. His BMI was 35.3. And on the first day of off-season practice, after a 3.5-week break, the linemen were asked to run 10 110-yard sprints or gassers in 19 seconds with 45-second rest period. This is a 1-to-3 work-to-rest ratio. The strength and conditioning coach at the school had a history of being abusive. The temperature that day was 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the athlete was reported to be receiving, adequate hydration. Well, if we look at that 110 yards and divide it by 19 seconds, It's approximately 5.8 or 6 yards per second. That's the equivalent, if you continue at that pace, of running a sub 6-minute mile. How many athletes that are BMI of 35 can run a 6-minute mile? This is almost 2 times faster than the aerobic maximum of an average athlete with a BMI of 35.3, which is 3.2 yards per second. So when this happens and you're running at these speeds, there is a high risk of developing lactic acid, increasing your core temperature, and developing exertional heat stroke, which is exactly what happened. And after 7 gassers, Jordan was reported to be exhausted. His coaches encouraged him to continue, though, and asked his teammates to assist him. Instead of immediate treatment, the trainers walked him away from the medical center. Let's just walk it off. No core body temperature was taken. There was no ice bath. And there was a delay in transferring him to the emergency room. It was 45 minutes of symptoms until 911 was called. Well, when Jordan reached the emergency room, he was unconscious. His core temperature was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. He required a liver transplant, and sadly, he died 2 weeks later. Scott, any comments?
No, not at this point.
Okay, I mean, just tragic to hear this story, so preventable. So let's just look at this chart. And I'm not recommending that we go out there and start training these athletes in order to be aerobic milers, because we really don't need to train linemen to become distance runners or have fantastic aerobic capacity. But if you do want to work on improving their aerobic capacity, let's just look at these numbers. If you have an athlete whose BMI is 35 and you want them to do a 110-yard sprint, they should be starting at a speed of 38, 39 seconds, not 19 seconds. And then you have to work your way up slowly. So we're way off base here with our exercise physiology. What about Braden Bradforth? So Braden's BMI was 37.5. He was 6'3", 300 pounds. He was a lineman, of course. First day of preseason. This happens so many times the first or second day of preseason or off season. Punishment drills, 36 50-yard sprints. He's asked to run them at an 8-second race pace with 30-second rest periods. The temperature was 84 degrees Fahrenheit. It was warm, it was hot, but it wasn't super hot. This equates to a 4.7-minute mile pace. Again, how many athletes with a BMI of 37 can run a sub 5-minute mile? So these are just ridiculous numbers. This would extrapolate to a VO2 max of 49, which is 82% above what an average athlete with a BMI has. So we're asking these obese athletes to run at twice their maximum aerobic capacity pace, which creates a heat bomb and is a death sentence. Here's the chart again. The BMI was 37, 50-yard dashes. He was asked to run them in 8 seconds. You should be starting at 18 seconds. So significant difference. This is all avoidable by adhering to some simple principles of exercise physiology. Scott, do you have any other comments about the exercise programs?
Yeah, I mean, as we look at those two cases, they're both linemen, and again, as we've in our research, that's the case. 97% were linemen in our research. They were both involved in conditioning, and that's 100% in our data set, or the deaths are involved in conditioning. Not just conditioning, but both of these were day one and in tests, in allegedly fitness tests as well. And so as we look at these, they're not sensitive to fitness. They're not specific to football. The regimens, they're not, certainly not specific to linemen, and they were in shorts, so uniform isn't a factor. Environment, it was an extreme environment, certainly for Jordan McNair. So they're running in relatively safe conditions. And so, again, as we look at our historic precautions, and what we need to focus on in terms of prevention. These cases are have a lot of take homes and are good for teaching.
Thank you. So in conclusion, prevention is always better than treatment. Let's not put our trainers in the situation of trying to save somebody. Let's prevent them. Overexertion during conditioning is the primary cause. Let's try to come up with rational exercise programs. Okay, first and second day of preseason and off season, start slow. 50% of max at most. Linemen are the at-risk athletes. They should not be training with the skilled players. And we need to develop appropriate position-specific training programs for these athletes. Any final comments, Scott?
No, again, just focus on linemen as the at-risk individual and position-specific training. Just those things that Dr. Boden just mentioned and that we've tried to highlight throughout, because again, this is a preventable heat stroke in football.
Thank you very much, Scott, for participating. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let's try to think about these issues and get these numbers down. So when we look at the numbers in 5 years, there's been a big drop. We know what the problem is. Now we just have to reach the masses and encourage all the coaches to start thinking about proper exercise activities. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us. Again, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.